Sup everyone, Thomas here, aka Reshiram's trainer, and welcome back to another episode of Reshiram Reviews. This time, we'll be covering a game that I, and a large portion of the internet, have been waiting for over half a decade. Hollow Knight Silksong. Now, if you were to ask me what my favourite game of all time is, the answer is Breath of the Wild. But if you were to ask me what my favourite indie game is, well then my answer is Terraria. But if you were to ask me my second favourite indie game, well then my answer would have to be Hollow Knight. I absolutely love Hollow Knight, with its interesting and varied bosses, memorable characters, fun to explore world, and a game that while it was challenging, also felt quite fair for the most part. So naturally, I've been eagerly awaiting for Silksong to finally release, and on September 4th, it finally released. And it crashed Steam. No joke, the first boss of Silksong isn't Moss Mother, it's these arseholes. Like, I live in the same time zone as Team Cherry, and the game released around 11:30 PM here, and it took me like 2 hours to finally buy the damn game, because that many people were simultaneously trying to buy it. Thankfully, I was still trying to finish the playthrough of the first game at the time, so I had some time to kill. But the more important question, was it worth the wait? Well, in my opinion, yes, absolutely. Despite some of the things I'll say later on, this is a phenomenal game that manages to live up to its already amazing predecessor. There's a lot to discuss, and I think the best place to start would be the story. The story of this game starts with our protagonist, Hornet, having been captured and brought to the land of Farloom, before managing to escape, now with the goal of climbing her way up to the Citadel for answers. Along the way, meeting a bunch of interesting characters, fighting a large variety of bosses, and exploring a ton of new areas. Speaking of which, there's a lot of areas in this game, and while there are some that are quite big, like Greymoor or the Firefields, most areas in this game are noticeably smaller than a lot of the areas in Hollow Knight. Though where they lack in size, they make up for its sheer number. There's a lot of areas in this game. Some big, some small, and some that can burn in hell. Silksong's map is quite large, especially compared to the previous game. And while it's quite easy to get lost, it's certainly fun to explore, given how many little secrets you can find around the map. But it's also fun to explore the map because of all the movement abilities Hornet gains throughout the game. While there are a lot of the same abilities as the first game, like dash, wall jump and double jump, there's also some new abilities, like the glide and claw line. Hornet also has the ability to grab onto the edge of platforms, which is nice. Another difference is that with the dash, while simply pressing the button does a small dash, holding the button makes Hornet go into a full-on sprint, which is great for traversing the land of Farloom. All of this to say that one of the biggest differences between Hornet and the Knight is that Hornet is noticeably more agile, and this extends to combat. While the basics of combat are the same, Silksong adds a couple more things to spice it up, most notably, tools. These are basically the replacement for charms in Hollow Knight, some of which can be used in combat as alternative weapons, like throwing knives, saws, and even drones. And in addition to that, there's also the crests, which change your basic melee moveset. The one you start with is the Crest of the Hunter, but there's a few more you can get throughout the game, like the Crest of the Beast, the Crest of the Witch, and my personal favourite, the Crest of the Reaper. There's also the Crest of the Wanderer, which gives you the original Hollow Knight moveset, which is really cool. All of these things can help give you the edge in combat, because trust me, you're gonna need it. Because if there's one thing about this game that people complain about, it's the difficulty. Silksong is a very hard game, and often makes the first game seem easy by comparison, and the first game was already quite difficult at times. That's not to say the difficulty is unfair though. While there were some enemies and bosses that could best be described as complete bullshit, there were also quite a few bosses that, while still challenging, actually felt fair, and more importantly, beatable. As in, if I died, I could usually tell where I went wrong, and how to improve next time, with bosses like Widow and Phantom being some of my favourites. But there were also plenty of bosses that felt harder than they needed to be. Savage Beastfight being my go-to example. While the boss itself has pretty basic attacks, and generally isn't too hard to avoid, the problem is that halfway through the fight, he starts summoning enemies, giving you even more things to pay attention to. And do you want to know the worst part about this boss? He deals double damage. In fact, a majority of bosses in this game deal double damage. Now sure, Hollow Knight had plenty of bosses and enemies that dealt double damage, but most of them were either quite late in the game, or had very predictable and easy to dodge attacks. In Silksong, enemies and bosses start dealing true damage very early on. Hell, Beast deals double damage, and she's the second boss in the game. Despite all this, I do think the game's difficulty is somewhat reasonable for the most part. Sure, it's stupidly hard at times, but it does feel fair. Moving away from difficulty, I think one of the biggest things that sets Silksong apart from the first game is Hornet herself. And more accurately, Hornet's actually a fleshed out character. If we look back at the first game, the knight was somewhat of a blank slate. No mind to think, no will to break, no voice to cry suffering. We didn't see them talk, we didn't see them show emotion, nothing. Now obviously, this makes sense given the lore, being a vessel and all that. Now compare that to Hornet, someone who has a personality, and someone who actually talks, even referencing the first game on occasion, which was always nice. Seeing her interact with other characters helped make Silksong feel different from Hollow Knight, and definitely made for a more enjoyable experience. And with that, I think I've covered everything I wanted to discuss. So after taking everything into consideration, what would I rate this game? On one hand, it built upon its already amazing predecessor, and was generally really fun. But on the other hand, the difficulty felt a little too much at times. And after thinking it over, I've decided to give this game 4.5 out of 5 fusion flares. Hollow Knight Silksong is an incredible game that was well worth the wait, although the difficulty could be toned down slightly in some areas at least. But what did you guys think? What are your opinions on Hollow Knight Silksong? Be sure to let me know down in the comments. But that's going to do it for me here. Don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps this channel out. Have a great day everyone, and I'll see you next time. See ya!